Have you ever wondered what happens in hospitals when the lights go out and silence takes over? Imagine being alone in an old building where every shadow seems to hold a story. On my last week of the night shift, something inexplicable happened that sent chills down my spine. From a phone that should have been muted to whispers coming from empty rooms, what I witnessed goes beyond the horror stories we tell to scare newcomers. Do you want to know what really happened that night? The clock struck 7 p.m. as I entered the hospital for another night shift. The fluorescent lights flickered lazily, casting restless shadows in the empty corridors. I, a 32-year-old transporter with 5 years of experience, was about to face my last week in the old building before moving to the new facilities. The hospital, built in the 1930s, exuded an aura of untold stories and buried secrets. Its peeling walls and creaking floors were silent witnesses to countless lives saved and lost. At night, the place took on a completely different atmosphere, as if the past decided to wake up and wander through the hallways. My job consisted of transporting patients between floors and departments. It was a routine I knew well, but it never ceased to surprise me with its nighttime peculiarities. On that particular night, a strange feeling hung in the air, as if the hospital itself was conscious of its imminent retirement. As I walked towards the elevator, I passed by the recently closed East Wing on the 4th floor. The silence there was different, denser, almost palpable. Little did I know that this area would be the setting for one of the most inexplicable nighttime horror stories I would ever encounter. Stepping into the elevator, I reflected on the countless night shift ghost stories circulating among the staff. I had always treated them with skepticism, favoring rational explanations for the strange nighttime occurrences. However, something told me that this night would be different, that I was about to become a part of one of those true horror stories that made newcomers tremble. The elevator bumped to a stop at the 4th floor, and the doors opened to reveal the partially lit corridor of the West Wing. My task was simple: fetch a patient for routine exams. As I made my way to the designated room, I noticed a small group of nurses standing near the nursing station, their faces pale and tense. Intrigued, I approached them. "Is everything okay?" I asked, noticing their frightened stares. One of the nurses, her hands trembling, began to recount what had just happened. They had decided to take one last look at the East Wing for nostalgia's sake, but what they found there defied any logical explanation. "The phone rang," she whispered, her voice slightly shaking. "We thought it was impossible since all the devices had been removed." She went on to describe how, driven by curiosity, she answered the call. On the other end was a confused female voice asking where she was. The conversation that followed made my blood run cold. The nurse tried to calm the mysterious caller, explaining that she was in the hospital. But when the call abruptly ended, and they checked the origin of the call, they discovered it had come from an empty room next door, visible through the window of the nursing station. As I listened to the account, a chill ran down my spine. This was one of those truly scary stories that I always believed were exaggerations or made up. But there I was, witnessing the terror in the eyes of those experienced professionals who now sought refuge in the West Wing. The air felt heavier, charged with an unexplainable energy. The lights flickered momentarily, as if the hospital itself was reacting to the story. I tried to maintain my composure, rationalizing what had happened, but a part of me knew I had witnessed something beyond normal comprehension. "Are you sure there was no one in the room?" I asked, desperately seeking a logical explanation. They nodded in unison, their eyes still wide with fear. At that moment, I realized that this night would become one of the spine-chilling night shift stories that would circulate in the new hospital for years to come. After hearing the disturbing account from the nurses, I tried to focus on the task at hand. I walked to the patient's room, my mind still processing the inexplicable events in the East Wing. The hospital felt different now, as if every shadow hid a secret, and every corner whispered night shift horror stories. Entering the room, I found the patient sitting on the bed, his face pale in the dim light of the lamp. "Are you ready for the exam?" I asked, forcing a smile. He silently nodded, his eyes fixed on a point beyond me. As I helped him settle into the wheelchair, I noticed his hands were cold as ice. On our way to the examination room, we passed by the corridor leading to the East Wing. The patient suddenly grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "Do you hear it too?" he whispered, his eyes wide with fear. I stopped, my heart racing. For a moment, I thought I heard a distant murmur, like a muffled voice coming from the closed wing. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the sensation. "It must be the wind," I replied, more to convince myself than to reassure him. But the patient didn't seem convinced. His gaze remained fixed on the darkness of the abandoned corridor, as if he saw something I couldn't perceive. I hurried, eager to leave that area behind. The corridor lights flickered again, casting strange shadows on the walls. For an instant, I thought I saw a shadowy figure in the reflection of a window. But when I looked directly, there was nothing there. Upon reaching the examination room, I handed the patient over to the technician. He seemed relieved to be away from the gloomy corridor, but still shot nervous glances at the door. As I prepared to leave, the technician pulled me aside. "Have you noticed anything strange tonight?" he asked in a low voice. "The equipment is acting weird, as if there's interference." I hesitated before answering, thinking of the terrifying night shift tales I was experiencing. "It's probably due to the relocation," I replied, trying to sound convincing, but the words rang hollow even to my own ears. Something was definitely wrong on this last night in the old hospital, and I had a feeling that the worst was yet to come. The hours dragged on as I continued my shift, each minute laden with tension. The ghost stories of night shift workers, which once seemed like mere tales to scare newcomers, now took on a new dimension of reality. The hospital, on its last night of operation, seemed determined to reveal its darkest secrets. Around 3 a.m. I was called back to the 4th floor. A patient needed to be transferred to the ICU. As I stepped out of the elevator, I noticed that the corridor lights were dimmer than usual, creating elongated shadows that seemed to move on their own. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of medical equipment. As I approached the patient's room, I heard a sound that made my heart stop for a moment, the unmistakable ring of a phone. It was coming from the direction of the east wing, now completely empty and dark. My mind screamed at me to ignore it and focus on my task, but my feet seemed to have a mind of their own. Slowly, I found myself walking towards the sound. With each step, the air grew colder, and I could swear I heard muffled whispers all around me. Reaching the abandoned nursing station, I saw the phony and old device that should have been removed days ago. It kept ringing, its sound echoing through the empty hallways. With a trembling hand, I reached out and picked up the receiver. "Hello?" My voice came out as a hoarse whisper. For a moment, I heard only static. Then, a female voice, the same one described by the nurses earlier, spoke. "It's time to go. All of us." At that instant, the lights flickered violently and then went out completely. I was immersed in total darkness for a few seconds that felt like an eternity. When the lights returned, the phone had vanished. I stood there, dazed, trying to process what had just happened. I ran back to the West Wing, my heart pounding. I found my colleagues in a similar state of agitation. They had all experienced something inexplicable in the last few minutes, equipment turning on by itself, doors closing, and even glimpses of figures in the corners of their eyes. When the sun finally rose, marking the end of our last shift in the old hospital, we all left together, casting nervous glances over our shoulders. The building stayed behind, its dark windows staring at us like empty eyes. That night, we all became part of the true horror stories that would haunt the new hospital for years to come. As we walked away, I couldn't help but think that the old hospital had bid us farewell in its own peculiar way. The haunted experiences of the night shift would forever be etched in our memories, a reminder of the mysteries that sometimes defy explanation, even in the world of science and medicine. Have you ever imagined being alone in a hospital at night and seeing someone who shouldn't be there? Let me tell you about the night I encountered an elderly lady in an empty room, only to find out that she had passed away hours earlier. The dark corridors and unexplained sounds had always been part of the night shift. But on that dawn, everything changed. Are you ready to uncover what happened next? With 3 years of experience as a night shift cleaning assistant, I was already accustomed to the silent and sometimes disturbing routine of that place. The building, an imposing structure of concrete and glass, seemed to come alive during the late hours, its corridors echoing with unexplained sounds that I preferred to ignore. On that particular night, I was assigned to clean 2 recently vacated rooms on the 3rd floor. There were connecting rooms, sharing a single exit to the main corridor. As I pushed my cleaning cart into the elevator, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The air felt denser, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. I started with the first room, following my usual routine. I changed the linens, disinfected the surfaces, and swept the floor with mechanical efficiency. My thoughts wandered, as they often did during these repetitive tasks. I reflected on how my life had led me to this solitary job, cleaning up after strangers during their stays in the hospital. After finishing the first room, I realized I needed to restock my supplies. I left my cart in the hallway and headed down to the storage room in the basement. The hospital at night was a maze of shadows and flickering fluorescent lights, each dark corner seemingly hiding secrets I preferred not to uncover. 10 minutes later, I returned with the necessary items, ready to tackle the second room. That's when everything changed. As I entered the room, my heart nearly stopped. Seated in a chair by the window was an elderly lady. She was hunched over herself, as if carrying the weight of the world on her frail shoulders. For a few seconds, I stood frozen, staring at this unexpected figure. My mind struggled to process the situation. It was odd that a new patient had already been placed there, especially without any notification. But before I could react, 2 nurses appeared in the doorway, their expressions of shock matching my own confusion. The nurses looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Were you sitting in the chair?" one of them asked, her voice trembling as she broke the oppressive silence of the room. Confused, I replied that I hadn't, explaining about the elderly lady I had seen just moments earlier. The nurses exchanged worried glances, their faces paling visibly under the cold light of the room. Intrigued and a bit frightened, I decided to check for myself. I took a few hesitant steps towards the chair, my heart racing with each movement. To my astonishment, the seat was empty. The lady had vanished without a trace. A chill ran down my spine as I tried to comprehend what was happening. There was no way she could have left the room without me seeing Harry was blocking the only exit. The nurses, still visibly disturbed, began to ask rapid questions about the woman's appearance. I described her as best I could. Gray hair, wrinkled face, faded floral dress. As I spoke, I noticed the nurses growing paler. One of them muttered something about checking the hospital records, while the other remained in the room with me, her eyes nervously scanning every corner of the space. At that moment, I began to sense the weight of the true night shift horror stories I had heard over the years. I had always dismissed them as exaggerations or the fertile imagination of tired colleagues. But now, standing in that seemingly empty room, I couldn't help but question everything I believed to be real. The silence of the hospital seemed to amplify each beat of my heart, each ragged breath. The nurse who stayed with me finally broke the silence. "You know," she began, her voice almost a whisper, "there are night shift ghost stories in this hospital. Things that no one can explain." She hesitated for a moment before continuing. "But I never thought I'd live to see something like this." Her words echoed through the room, adding a new layer of tension to the already heavy air. I wanted to say something, anything to ease the oppressive atmosphere, but the words stuck in my throat. The silence that followed was interrupted by the hurried return of the other nurse. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock. "You won't believe this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The description you gave, it matches exactly a patient who passed away in this room just 4 hours ago, shortly before your shift started." The revelation hit us like a bucket of cold water. My mind spun, trying to process the information. The spine-chilling night shift stories I had heard over the years suddenly felt much more real and close to home. A shiver ran down my spine as I looked back at the empty chair, half expecting to see the elderly lady materialize before my eyes. The nurses began to quietly discuss among themselves, their eyes darting nervously around the room. I stood motionless, feeling as if my feet were rooted to the floor. The atmosphere in the room had changed drastically. The air felt heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. It was as if the room itself was aware of our presence and the extraordinary event that had just occurred. As the nurses continued their hushed conversation, my mind wandered to all the other nights I had spent in this hospital. How many times had I ignored that feeling of being watched, attributing it to fatigue or an overactive imagination? The truly scary night shift stories I heard from other staff members now took on a new dimension of reality. Suddenly, a soft sound caught my attention. It was almost imperceptible, like the rustle of fabric. I turned slowly, my heart pounding. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a translucent figure near the window. But when I blinked, it was gone. The nurses seemed to notice something too. As they stopped their quiet conversation, their eyes fixed on the same spot I was looking at. At that instant, I realized that this night would mark a before and after in my life. The true horror stories of the night shift that I'd previously dismissed as fiction were now part of my reality. The hospital, which I knew so well, suddenly felt like a completely different place, filled with mysteries and secrets I had never imagined. As I exchanged glances with the nurses, I understood that we were bound by this incredible experience. A story that few would believe, but that would forever change our perception of the world around us. The hours that followed seemed to drag on indefinitely. None of us dared to leave the room immediately, as if fearing to break the spell or the nightmare that we had experienced. The nurses and I remained silent, each lost in our own thoughts, trying to rationalize the inexplicable. As the night progressed, I began to reflect on all the other nights I had spent in this hospital. How many times had I ignored that feeling of being watched, attributing it to fatigue or an overactive imagination? The truly scary night shift stories I heard from my colleagues always seemed exaggerated, but now I was part of them. The reality of what we had witnessed hung over us, impossible to ignore or explain away. Slowly, we started to share our previous experiences. One of the nurses mentioned hearing footsteps in empty corridors, while the other spoke of medical equipment that seemed to operate on its own in the middle of the night. Each story added to the sense that the hospital held more secrets than we had ever imagined. The terrifying night shift tales came to life in our words, each account more chilling than the last. As the sky began to brighten, bringing the first rays of sunlight through the hospital window, I felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The tension that had enveloped us seemed to dissipate gradually, as if the daylight chased away the shadows of the night and their mysteries. I looked at the nurses and saw the same relief in their eyes that I felt. We had survived one of the true night shift horror stories, and the dawn brought with it a long-awaited sense of normalcy. As we prepared to leave the room and resume our routines, I realized that something within me had fundamentally changed. The haunted night shift experiences were no longer just stories to me, they were a reality I had lived through. The hospital, with its silent corridors and empty rooms, would never be the same to my eyes. I left the room with a new understanding of the world around me, aware that there is more between heaven and earth than our philosophy can explain. The night shift horror stories I once dismissed are now part of my own story, an experience that I will carry with me forever changing my perception of what is possible in this mysterious and sometimes frightening world we live in. Have you ever felt a fear so real that it made your heart almost stop? It was a cold October night, and I was alone in the shadowy basement of the city hall, a place where time stood still and horror stories come to life. When the lights went out and the sound of banging cells echoed in the dark, I realized that perhaps those stories weren't just meant to scare newcomers. Want to know what happened next? Stay with me and find out. I was 25 years old when I started working as a security guard at the city hall. With only 6 months of experience, I was still getting accustomed to the peculiarities of the night shift. The City Hall building was an imposing 19th century structure, with 3 floors above ground and a basement that few people knew about. On that October night, the air was cold and damp as I arrived for my shift at 10 p.m. The streets were deserted and the silence was broken only by the occasional howl of the wind. I entered the building, greeting the colleague from the previous shift with a wave. My routine included regular rounds throughout the entire building, but the part that bothered me the most was the basement. Down there was a set of abandoned detention cells, remnants from a time when the city hall also served as the local jail. Those cells hadn't been used in decades, but they were still part of my patrol route. As the night progressed, I tried to distract myself with mundane thoughts, avoiding recalling the night shift horror stories that the more experienced colleagues used to tell. They were spine-chilling tales that I preferred to believe were just made up to scare newcomers. Around 1 a.m., it was time for my second round in the basement. I took a deep breath, grabbed my flashlight, and descended the creaky stairs. The basement was a place that seemed frozen in time. A long corridor, approximately 20 meters wide and 100 meters long, stretched before me with rusty metal cells on both sides. Old lamps hung from the low ceiling, casting a dim, yellowish light over the area. I began my inspection, walking slowly and checking each cell. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the echo of my footsteps. I was passing by the fourth row of cells when, suddenly, all the lights went out. My heart raced. I quickly turned on my flashlight and turned back towards the switch at the beginning of the corridor. As I walked, I tried to convince myself that it was just a common electrical issue, unrelated to the true scary stories I had heard. I was about to reach the switch when, inexplicably, the lights flickered back on. I stood frozen for a moment, my mind struggling to process what was happening. This is crazy, I thought. I need to get out of here. Determined to complete my round as quickly as possible, I started to walk briskly down the corridor. Glancing briefly into each cell, my heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the cold sweat trickling down my back. I was almost halfway when the lights went out again. This time the darkness felt denser, more menacing. And then I heard two cells banging shut with force. The sound echoed through the corridor, making my blood run cold. It couldn't have been the wind or a rat. That sound was unmistakable, metallic and heavy. Someone or something had slammed two cells shut with violence. At that moment, all of the night shift ghost stories I had heard seemed to come alive. Without a second thought, I started to run. My flashlight illuminated the way ahead, the shadows dancing on the walls as if they were chasing me. I ran like I had never run before. The corridor seemed endless, each meter an eternity. Finally, I reached the stairs and climbed them two at a time, almost tripping in my desperate haste. I arrived at my workstation breathless and trembling. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely dial my supervisor's number. When he answered, my voice came out in gasps. Any electrical issues reported tonight? His negative response only heightened my terror. If it wasn't an electrical problem, what could explain what I had experienced? The remaining 2 hours of my shift were a nightmare. Every sound made me jump, and every shadow seemed to hide a threat. I stayed at my station, unable to conduct further rounds, my thoughts a chaotic mix of fear and disbelief. When the sun finally rose and my shift ended, I left the building with shaky legs. That night completely changed my perception of the night shift, and the stories I had once dismissed as mere night shift scary stories. But the memories of that night, the sounds, the lights, the terror remain vivid in my mind. It was an experience that fits perfectly among the true horror stories that circulate among night workers. A reminder that sometimes in the darkness of the night, we encounter things that defy our comprehension. If you enjoyed the video you just watched, you won't want to miss this next one. Click now and I'll see you there.